everyone, welcome to the January 12th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and as usual, we're looking ahead to some Saturday racing. Was kind of struggling to come up with which sequence we wanted to talk about on the podcast this week. I was initially leaning towards Aqueduct, since I think the end of the card is pretty interesting on Saturday, but the stakes came up with just a 5-horse field as part of that sequence. Some less than interesting races to kick it off, so I wasn't thrilled with that. Felt the same way about Santa Anita. We were looking at a few races out there, some small fields, and particularly one of the stakes races. So wanted to keep an open mind, and we don't often talk about any of these sequences that put together multiple tracks, but we're going to do that this week. We're going to take a look at the cross-country Pick 5 sequence. 3 tracks in this cross-country Pick 5, Tampa, Aqueduct, and Oaklawn. The sequence in order goes with Tampa race 7 kicking things off. That's the Gasparilla Stakes. Then Aqueduct race 8, Aqueduct race 9, those 2 races that I actually liked from the Aqueduct sequence that ends that card. Then the 4th leg is Tampa race 9, that's the Pasco Stakes, and then we'll finish things out with the 8th race at Oaklawn, a non-stakes event, but a very interesting allowance race to close things out. And it's not an easy sequence, but I think that the players will be happy because this cross-country Pick 5 sequence is a player-friendly sequence. You've got that low 15% takeout, with this being a bet that's run by Naira. That takeout is set at 15%, like the late Pick 5 there. And also, it's a sequence that excludes the CAW player, so everybody likes that too.
Yeah, it is. It's fun for me. I've never actually played one of these, but I do have the availability to play it. And when you mentioned it, I had actually thought of it last week as I was watching the Fox show and said, oh, maybe we should give this a try. So I was happy when you suggested it. Maybe a little less enthusiastic once I looked at the sequence and saw how hard it is. But no, I just joke. It's a tough sequence, but I think that's kind of what we want as horse players, because at the end of the day, we want the ability to make a score, not hit a Pick 5 that's going to pay $300 or something like that. So I think it's a fun sequence, and I look forward to talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, this podcast is about trying to give out ideas in these sequence, hopefully ideas that the listeners can combine with their own handicapping of these races. And sometimes it's not giving out the exact ticket that people are going to play, but just lending some insight that might help people who already have an opinion in some of these races. So hopefully we're able to help towards that, even if it might be difficult to give out a winning Pick 5 ticket based on just one or both of our opinions, because like Craig said, it's not an easy sequence. I chose it because Craig and I had already taken a look at the Gasparilla and Pasco Stakes, and I think we had some interesting takes on those. We did DRF Stakes previews of those races if you want to check out our videos on each of them on DRF's YouTube page. And I obviously had handicapped the 8th and 9th from Aqueduct and liked those races. The last leg, I think, is going to be interesting, maybe a bit of a struggle, but we'll get there at the end of the sequence with that Oaklawn race being leg 5 of this cross-country Pick 5. So, Craig, let's kick things off with that first leg of the sequence, which is Tampa race 7. The approximate post time for this is 3:34 p.m., and you do want to be aware of these post times. I'll read them out as we go through this, because sometimes tracks can get a little bit delayed. Whether or not one track runs before another one, its sequence is going to be set in the order that the original post times were set at. So I'll read those off as we go through. But the Gasparilla race 7 being the first leg, 7 furlongs for the 3-year-old fillies. And this is one that we talked about already a little bit when we did that stakes preview. And I think we both are a little bit skeptical of the horse that's likely to be the favorite in this race, that being the number 1 Mystic Lake. Just a lot of questions for this Saffie Joseph trainee to answer, because she really came to hand on the synthetic course up at Woodbine, ran well 3 times there, faced much better company than she's going to be meeting in this race. However, can she handle the dirt? That's the big question. And also, what kind of trip is she going to get from the rail as a horse who wants to show speed?
Yeah, very true. She didn't run very well on dirt the first time out. And I mentioned on our preview, you don't really want to condemn a horse to one surface or hating a surface off of one effort. But when that horse is going to be possibly odds on, and if not much higher than that, the morning line 6-5, I believe. I think it's a good idea to really question horses like this. She has much the best speed figures, but as you said, the surface is an issue. I think her running style could be an issue. She's I mean, clearly a horse who needs the lead. She broke her maiden that way. Her next two starts as she stretched out. She's led early and faltered late, and 7 furlongs from the rail in a race that we have coded as a fast pace, which we can address a little bit more as we move on. But just to touch on it, it's not going to be easy for her, even if she does handle the dirt. Now, clearly, if she runs as well as she has on synthetic, she is the horse to beat, and the morning line makes a lot of sense. I just think it's a proposition that I don't think I'd want to put a lot of my play going through.
Yeah, I mean, she just has those surface questions to answer. Obviously, not company, because, like you said, she's faced really good horses, but also she's coming off Lasix here, which is something that the other horses in this race don't have to deal with. I think it's interesting that after that first race, Saffie Joseph shipped her right up to Woodbine. Was it to get Lasix? Was it to get on the synthetic course? He does keep a string up at Woodbine these days, but still, interesting move, especially for a horse that took so much money on debut at Gulfstream in her only dirt start. Had some trouble at the start, but really just lacked any punch that day. So it's going to be interesting to see if she's got more to offer in this race. Personally, I'm almost always against horses like this, and I know that she kind of lays over this field based on those synthetic races, but that's not the way that I handicap, to just assume that she's going to translate that form to this dirt race. So I'm against her in this spot. This sequence is so complicated. There are so many horses that you might want to use later on. Personally, I just wouldn't be able to afford using a horse that I'm somewhat against. So she's not going to be on my tickets anywhere. And I think that if you kind of erase her from this race, Greg, which I think is a wise thing to do if you're trying to find some alternative, just sort of take the favorite out and handicap the race without her in it. And I think once you do that, the number 6 Gorgeous Girl becomes a very logical horse, especially based off her last effort where she ran pretty well against a decent group of males.
She did, and she did it in a race where the pace wasn't all that strong. It was a race that we have one of them coded in blue, and it was just a better field than what she's facing here. You can see it in the TimeformUS race rating. She ran it was the 88 that day. This race is only an 85, and when you consider these are newly turned 3-year-olds, those ratings are going to be increasing as time goes on. So that race was probably a good 3 or 4 lengths faster. I think she ran fine that day, and I think she is probably the horse to beat outside of the one. Not that there's not some others that don't have credentials. I mean, we have the horse just her inside, Gervin's Princess, who has had 2 easy wins in a row running similar speed figures, just doing it against lesser company. But as you brought up on our race preview, I'm not sure the lesser company really applies all that much in here. It's not like we have a bunch of proven stakes horses. We definitely do not. A lot of these horses are coming out of claimers somewhere in the running lines. One horse that's not, and a horse that some people might find interesting, is Runaway Diva, the 4 horse. Ran a very nice race first time out at a big price. I think some of that was due to a little bit lesser known connections. Got an 82 TimeformUS speed figure that day, was very impressive. So I don't want to totally dismiss her. I made Gorgeous Girl my top pick on the show, but I'll turn it back to you so you can get to the horse that you like.
Yeah, once you get past the favorite in this race, there are a lot of ways to go. And it's not like Gorgeous Girl was a total standout on speed figures. I mean, we think maybe she has a slight class edge over this field from the last race, but it's very competitive once you get past that favorite. So I think you do have some decisions to make. Personally, I thought this was a slight step up for Gervin's Princess, and the same for Runaway Diva, even though the latter does have a nice speed figure for that debut race. I just wasn't in love with the competition that she was facing. And as I was going through this field, there are plenty of runners in here that have raced against claimers before, and typically you wouldn't give a look to those in a stakes race, but this is not as high of a quality stakes field, especially if you're kind of putting your hand over Mystic Lake as you would typically expect to see. So I'm not going to hold it against some horses that they've been in claiming company in the past, because honestly, it's not like Runaway Diva, who's coming out of a maiden special weight win, ran against a field that's so much better than some of the maiden 25 fields that you see a few of these others coming out of. And watching replays for this race, I was just kind of taken with the last race of the number 2 Copperbound, who is the other Greg Sacco trainee in this race. I know she wasn't facing much, but boy, was she so much better than that field last time. I mean, she made a big sweeping wide move around the far turn to take over an upper stretch, and just watching her stride through the lane, not only did she tower over that field from a form standpoint, but also she towered over that field physically too. I mean, this is the daughter of Copper Bullet, who's got some real size to her, and just seems like there's the frame of a decent horse there. And I mean, she was geared down at the end of that race, winning much easier than even the 6 length margin would indicate. And I started to go back through her form, and she's faced decent horses on a few occasions. I would say that was the case two back when she actually put in a pretty game effort to be second against Maiden Special Weight Company. A mile and 40 yards, probably a little far for her, but she was contesting an honest pace that day. And I think that's a fig that it's the best number that she's earned on the TimeformUS scale, at least 78, which puts her in contention here. And when you start to look through that field, especially for the winner, I mean, that seems like a legitimate number. Arguably, some horses in there could have run a little bit higher. She gets a live rider for this race in Gallardo. And I just think that she's not out of this, and she's going to be a very generous price in all likelihood, especially if the number one takes the kind of money that we think she is.
Yeah, for sure. She's a horse. When we first did the race, I wasn't impressed. As you say, the field was really weak. Even the horses that have run back has been poor. But sometimes you have to just put that aside. And at the price she's going to be, I have no problem using her on my ticket. So for me, I wound up. It came down to I decided I was going to use 5 horses, and the last horse was either going to be the 1 or the 2. One of them was going to get tossed, and for me, I'm always going to take the price horse with the upside, the 2 Copper Bound. The others I want to use are the 4, 5, and 6, who I already mentioned: Runaway Diva, Gervin's Princess, and Gorgeous Girl. And I also want to use a little bit of Delightful Summer, who's kind of a mid-price 8-1 on the morning line. Her running lines don't look all that good, but it's not like her speed figures are that far out of it. She's kind of right there with everybody else. And she seems to have a style where if things do get a little heated, which I think is really questionable. We haven't talked about it. The pace projector we have coded as fast. I just don't know. This race is pretty puzzling, and a lot of it is because of Mystic Lake and how she handles the surface, and if she gets out of the gate. If she does, I think it could get a little hot. If not, maybe it'd be a more moderate pace. So I don't want to play this race like based on that red flag.
Yeah, and Mystic Lake is probably the only horse in this race that really is a confirmed front runner. The others have all won or run their best races from a stalking or closing position. So you might even say that this should be a pace projector that doesn't have that fast pace flag just based on their running styles. And I mean, we'll see how that all plays out. However, the caveat to that is if Mystic Lake doesn't handle the dirt, maybe she doesn't have the speed that she's shown on the synthetic, and maybe she falls apart earlier. And sometimes those situations, if a horse just isn't handling the surface, it can bring the others into the race and create a different race flow than we otherwise might see. So a lot of variables in this Gasparilla. Not an easy way to start off the sequence, but I know both Craig and I wanted to take a stand against a horse that is going to be on a lot of people's tickets. Let's move on to the Aqueduct portion of this sequence. Leg 2 has a post time of 3:47 Eastern, and it is the 8th race at Aqueduct, and it's an allowance N1X going the 1-turn mile. And Craig, I personally thought this was the most interesting race of the day at Aqueduct on Saturday, so I'm happy that it's part of this sequence. You've got a really interesting field here. Horses coming in from different directions, some coming off layoffs, horses with back class, prior stakes form. Really, just a lot to sift through in this race. I'm really not even sure who's going to go favored. I had a lot of trouble making a morning line in this race. There are a couple of Chad Brown trainees, and the public often likes to default to that stable. So I would imagine that a horse like the number 4, Cascade, is going to take money in here. It should also be noted there's rain in the forecast, or really precipitation and storms in the forecast across the country this weekend. I think we're supposed to get some of that in New York on Saturday. So there's the potential for this track to come up wet at Aqueduct. And I think that's probably not going to bother Cascade too much, because even though he didn't run well in the Cigar Mile last time, that was kind of a ridiculous spot for him. His performance 2 back just makes him a very logical player in this field.
It does. He's not a horse I particularly love, because I think he'll probably be over betting here. I mean, his race in that allowance race in the slop, it kind of left me not all that excited about him. He ran a decent speed figure that day, but this is a race where there's definitely some other speeds in here, particularly Mama's Gold, the horse, the 10 horse, who's on a tear, having won 3 in a row by open lengths, including a 13 length win last time. Strangely enough, though, all 3 of those are in the slop as well. So I'm not sure what you make of it, but I'm looking at this race as one where I do agree with the pace projector. I expect the race to be pretty hot up front. So I was looking for a few horses that I would expect to run better in behind that race, in behind the pace. The first one I'll start with is the Bill Mott trainee, Silo Ridge. We actually have him shown up on the lead. That part of the pace projector, I don't really buy. I get why he's up there. He's been running shorter distances, been pretty close to the pace. But watching his races, he looks like a horse who I think would more tuck in behind. Seems like he has some upside, so I think he's a horse with a shot that should get a nice trip. Of the Chad Brown horses, I actually like the other one a little better. Expected Value, drawn just to the inside of his stablemate. He gets Manny Franco in the irons, who's been riding extremely well. And he's the one that I think has a little more upside. He's obviously had some issues. He has 2 big red lines in his PPs, and including bracketing his last start where the Bayshore, where he ran okay coming off of a layoff from his 2-year-old season, but as a newly turned 4-year-old, I think he's one that may get overlooked a little bit in here because his speed figures are obviously going to be lacking compared to some others as they occurred early in his 3-year-old season and 2-year-old season. But Chad Brown does good with this kind of horse. I looked it up. The ROI is rarely going to be great, and it wasn't in this case, but he wins with over 30% of these kind of starters on dirt. So I don't have too many issues with the layoff there. Another horse I was interested in was Whittington Park, who's drawn on the far outside. And he's just a horse who always seems to show up and run his race. The one time he shows a win, well, he has a few wins in there, but one of his wins came when it was a red paste color coding. And I think that's what he's going to get here. So I can see him getting a really nice trip from the outside. And if he runs his usual 110 speed figure, I could see him being right there.
Yeah, I'm also interested to see how this pace develops. I kind of tend to agree with you. Looking at the pace projector, I'd probably switch the positions of the number 4 and the number 6. I think that Cascais has to go from the inside and try to secure that position because he did run so well with the lead in some prior starts. And whether a few of these horses can win without the early lead is a big question mark because a horse like Mama's Gold, it seems like he needs to be in front to run his best race and kind of needs to be alone in front, relaxing. That's sort of been what he's been his specialized at lately, just getting into that rhythm, setting his own pace, and using that high cruising speed to his advantage. I mean, he just brings the rain because Mama's Gold, as you said, caught 3 sloppy tracks in a row, but feels like it's going to be a 4th on Saturday. He did run a huge speed figure last time, but that was against much weaker competition. And going the 1-turn mile with a likely faster pace, he's a little tough for me to make a case for in here. So I've been wrong about him before recently, but he's going to have to beat me in this spot. As far as the Chad Brown runners go, I tend to agree with your assessment, though I'm not as against Cascais as it sounds like you are, Craig. I respect his race 2 back, and I also respect the fact that Chad Brown even thought enough of him to run in the Cigar Mile last time, because that's not a typical move for this barn to just forego an N1X allowance condition to run in a graded stakes race. This horse had to be doing well going into that race. And obviously with the way the track played and him chasing outside and then just being such a tough spot, and actually the winner and second place finisher running as well as they did, he was never going to have a chance in that race. So I'm not going to hold it against him too much. He had shown real potential as a 2-year-old, kept really good company in those races. So really the speed figure 2 back, you could argue, is the only legitimate one that's predictive of how he's going to run in today's race. And that certainly makes him good enough. So I'm not against him by any means. I did think that a potential fast pace could favor Expected Value. And while, like you said, he hasn't run as fast, that Bayshore has been a pretty productive race. When you go and look in that chart, horses out of that race have actually improved their speed figures quite a bit, particularly the 2nd and 3rd place finishers, Gilmore and Victory Way. They turned out to be pretty good through the summer of last year. Joey Freshwater came back recently and ran a big speed figure to win. So feels like that was actually a solid field that he was right in the mix against at the finish. And I'm a little bit concerned that the layoffs have been surrounding that race. I mean, he was off for so long after his 2-year-old season, then off again for a long time after the Bayshore. When you watch his replays, he's this big, rangy horse who you can kind of understand why they've had trouble keeping on the racetrack. It looks like he's got a lot of size and weight to him. So we'll see if that's going to translate to a sloppy racetrack. But just with routine improvement that you'd expect from this barn, I think he makes some sense in this race. I do want to comment on the number 6 Silo Ridge, Craig. You brought him up. I maybe you can clarify for me whether you actually like him in this race or not. It sounds like you are a little more positive on him than I would be. His last race and speed figure, I think, is one that you have to kind of dive into a little bit in TimeformUS, because it does have that B notification next to the speed figure of the 111, which indicates when you click on it in the new TimeformUS, it brings up that speed figure notation explanation for the B, which indicates it's a breakout situation. Craig can talk more about that. But looking back through it, Craig, I wonder if breaking that race out was not the right call, because we've had 3 runbacks from that race. The only horse to repeat the speed figure was one that you would expect to improve, a horse that actually had a trip in that first start play. But the other 2 have regressed out of that race. And I just wonder if that race is really as good as we want it to be, based on the fact that Solo Ridge ran that big speed figure at Saratoga over the summer. He was a vet scratch prior to that last race, for whatever that's worth. Now he's stretching out to the mile. I'm not sure that I really view him as a horse that's supposed to get better with that at distance. So I was a little bit more on the fence about him. Whittington Park, who you also brought up, definitely stuff to like about him. I don't love that he went to the sidelines when he was seemingly in good form over the summer. I never like to see that. Maybe the connections were a little disappointed with the 4th place finish last time. And he was a horse that had been racing consistently for a long period of time. So perhaps he's just a horse that needed a break and they were aiming for the winter time. But that was a bit of a question mark for me, though. He is a horse that should be suited by the projected race flow of this race.
Yeah, I actually looked up Jeremiah Englehart's stats in those spots, and he does fine with a layoff. So I'm not sure what went wrong last time, but it wasn't a great trip wide around the turn. He's been working well since, so I wasn't too worried about the layoff. The ROI isn't great, but he wins plenty in this kind of scenario. As for that speed figure for Silo Ridge, I agree. It's one I've been tracking. I do think it needs to be broken out, because if I used a variant for it was the first race of the day, to be clear. It's just a matter of how much, and maybe we broke it out a little bit too much. If we didn't break it out at all, the figure would be like in the 80s, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense for these horses. And, it's a race at Aqueduct, this Aqueduct track. We talk about it every winter. It changes a lot during the day, almost every day. Some days are fine, some days not. I wish I could be there and watch what they actually do, because clearly something happens often. So it is a figure that I think you should have a little skepticism. But I would say maybe it should be a 102 or something like that, as opposed to a 111, which is pretty notable. But that said, I would still think this horse has some upside. So I wouldn't totally dismiss Silo Ridge in here.
Yeah, Craig, I ended up putting a horse on top that I just think is going to be the right price in here. And I admit that I have some concerns about how he's going to work out the right trip in this race. But the number 8, Principe Doro, just interests me based on his prior form. I mean, he was a pretty good horse at one point for Todd Pletcher. I mean, just look at the horses that he's faced in a few of his dirt races. I mean, he wasn't beaten that far by Giant Game back in February at Gulfstream of last year. Giant Game, obviously, I think he went on to win a grade 3 last season. Barber Road, I mean, who obviously was a very good 3-year-old at one point. And I know he finished further behind Giant Game when they last met in May at Churchill Downs last year, but Principe Doro had a real trip in that race. He was off a little bit awkwardly, then was steadied into the clubhouse turn, getting really keen in behind horses in the pocket. I'm not going to hold the turf race against him. I mean, he's tried the turf twice and just hasn't run as well on it as he has on the dirt. But when you isolate his dirt races and look at those speed figures from, when he was a younger 4-year-old, he certainly fits in this race. And Now he's first off a purchase by Linda Rice. He's listed as being an $80,000 auction purchase last year in the summertime, but listed as being purchased by his original breeder, Bobby Flay. Since then, he must have been transferred to New Connections, or maybe that sale didn't go through. I don't know what the story is, but he has since been acquired by New Connections and now with Linda Rice. And Linda Rice does better off the claim than she does off trainer switches or private purchases or auction purchases lumped in with those as well. But this horse, it's not like he needs to improve that much based on his prior form for her. And she can be pretty dangerous. And this feels like one that might actually slip through the cracks a little bit, especially in a race that is so competitive.
Yeah, the only thing that had me a little against this sort of, well, the layoff is part of it, and the trainer switch, as you said, it's not as great, but mostly it was the pace projector and the presence of Mama's Gold, because Principe de Oro's best races have come up on the front end, so it would probably take a change of running style. I guess the outside post helps a little bit, but I could see the horse winning, but he wasn't for me in this spot.
Yeah, I was just looking for somebody that I thought would be the right kind of price in a race where I was leaning towards the Chad Brown runners. I could see both of them taking some money in here. And yeah, the trip is a question mark for Principe d'Oro, but I do think Mama's Gold is going to be aggressively ridden crossover. And maybe this horse can just get into the clear outside of that rival and just kind of, stalk down the back stretch, racing in third or fourth. I'm hoping he doesn't get ranked in that situation like he did when he was stuck in behind horses two back at Churchill Downs. That's a very different kind of trip than being, the outside stalker four wide. So I'm hoping that he can work out that kind of trip in here, because I do think he still has some upside. It's not like they're dropping in for a tag off the layoff. I mean, she's running in the spot where he belongs. And maybe the fact that Eric Cancel is riding is going to be a negative for some people. But if you look up the stats, Eric Cancel has gotten some very live mounts for Linda over the past couple of years. And especially lately, she's been riding him a little bit more and been doing better, and the horses haven't been taking as much money as it seems like they might if Jose Lezcano or Carmouche were riding. So, and furthermore, beyond that, Eric Cancel is the kind of rider, if you're looking for somebody to not be aggressive and try to get a horse to settle down, he's probably a better fit for that than if I were looking for this horse to really send out of the gate. So we'll see how that all plays out. But I just thought he was an interesting horse to highlight in a race where I was mostly narrowed down to him as well as the Chad Brown pair.
Yeah, and for me, to be clear, my top pick would probably be Expected Value if I wasn't clear about that, followed by Whittingham Park, and then maybe a little bit of Silo Ridge and Cascase.
Let's move on to the other Aqueduct race in this sequence, which follows directly. The post time for this one, race 9, is 4:16 p.m. Eastern time. And it's the 9th race, New York bred maiden special weight event, going the 1 mile distance, same as the race we just talked about. 3-year-olds in action here. And interesting race, Craig. I think we've got a horse that is going to be a clear favorite in the number 4, the Big Torpedo, coming out of the much discussed Great White Way division of the New York Stallion series, and much discussed really in relation to this horse, because he was the victim of all that trouble that people were chatting about afterwards with the stewards, and a lot of differing opinions about that, who caused the trouble. But we don't have to rehash all of that now. I think everybody can agree this was the horse that was worst affected by that, of those that actually finished in the mix at the end. And I think you've got to give this horse a lot of credit for losing all his momentum, getting stopped and steadied in that traffic jam at the quarter pole, and then regathering himself to actually rally on and finish a close 4th in this race. And you could make the argument he might have actually won that race if not for that traffic jam.
Yeah, everything you say I agree with, and I'm not a guy that singles a lot of horses. I think we did one last time. It was a heavy favorite that did win, but this is a case where I'm probably going to single the Big Torpedo. I mean, he is clearly the fastest horse on TimeformUS speed figures, and as you note, he did it with quite a bit of trouble in there. So as I looked through the field, I was trying to compare everybody to him, and I just couldn't come up with a horse that I was like, yeah, that's a horse who could beat him. The only other horses who were close speed figure wise have only done it on turf and haven't run nearly as well on the dirt. So for me, he's clearly the horse to beat. And in what's a really tough sequence, I don't want to spend too much money just trying to find a horse that I don't really like, just looking for a price. So I would say probably all of my play is going to go through him.
Yeah, I also want to go pretty thinly through this race. There's one other horse that I do want to highlight in here, but the Big Torpedo, make no mistake about it. He is way the horse to beat in this race. He's not the same standout on buyers that he is on TimeformUS numbers, and I think that's because that New York Stallion Series Great White Way got a big pace upgrade on TimeformUS, which I think you have to consider. It was a fast-paced race, and the Big Torpedo was in pretty close attendance to it throughout. So I think it makes a lot of sense for him that he would get an upgraded number coming out of that race. And that speed figure doesn't even take into account the trouble that he received. And if he had been the winner of that race, it would be even higher. And I think you could make that legitimate argument that he should have been. So he makes a lot of sense in here. My one reservation, Craig, is the stretch out to a mile. I'm not sure that I really view this horse as one that wants to go this far. When I was first sort of assessing him on debut, I thought the turf sprint was a good spot for him, and he did finish pretty well going to 7 last time, even with some trouble. But I don't know if I view him as a horse that's really going to turn out to be a dirt router, but he might just be good enough to handle it against the group that he's facing here. So it's just a minor negative for me. And as I'm looking through, I didn't really want the horses that don't have that much upside. I mean, horses like the 2 In On It or the 5 Vinsanto and even Dixie Farrow, who's had a few less chances on the dirt, but has still run a number of times. And they're all coming out of a similar race where they kind of hit the wire together. And I was wondering if I really could project improvement for any of them. The horse that I think is interesting is actually another one coming out of that Brown Don't Stop race on December 17th. But that's the number 6, Malibu Margarita. And he finished behind those 3 horses that I just mentioned. But I'd be willing to give him a pass for that race because the connections were asking an awful lot of this horse to go from a 6 furlong debut where he only ran in spots to stretch all the way out to a mile and an eighth around 2 turns over a demanding Aqueduct track. It was not playing particularly quick that day. And I mean, he attended the pace and just got tired. And I honestly, that's to be expected for a horse that was making such a dramatic stretch out in distance. Now he's getting Lasix for the first time, like a lot of these, and he's turning back to the 1-turn mile distance, which is probably going to suit him a little bit better. And going back to his debut, I think he showed some quality that day. He had trouble at the start, was green through the early stage, was still green through the stretch, altering course, lugging in a little bit, but he was really finishing that day across the wire, galloping out well. And I just think there's more to this horse than we've seen in either of his first 2 starts. And now is the first time that he's got some foundation under his belt. It probably is in a spot and a distance where he's going to be a little bit more effective. The Rudy Rodriguez barn has been going pretty well lately, so this one's going to be a decent price, especially with a horse like the Big Torpedo in the race, a better price than he was last time for sure. So Malibu Margarita is very much the other horse that I wanted to press in here.
Yeah, I believe Rudy Rodriguez had a 3-win day, if I'm not mistaken, last weekend. Thursday didn't go so well, but yeah, he certainly signs the barns on the uptick. And I agree with you. I was going to use one other horse. He is the one horse that shows some upside for the reasons you mentioned. The others I just couldn't come up with a reason to put him on my ticket.
Well, let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, and we're going to go back down to Florida to talk about the 9th race from Tampa Bay Downs. That is the Pasco Stakes. Post time for this one, 4:32 p.m. Eastern Time. And similar conditions to the Gasparilla, Craig, just the 3-year-old males in action here. And I think it's a real uptick in quality from the female version of this race because you've got some horses with some legitimate stakes credentials in here, particularly the number 1 West Saratoga and the number 3 Bookham Dano. Both showed real quality as a 2-year-old. Bookham Dano's run the faster speed figures. I mean, he earned a nice number when he won the Futurity 2-back, winning that day by over 6 lengths. Where's Chris turned the tables on him last time in the Nashua, but both stepped up and ran a strong speed figure. Bookham Dano did get a good trip, setting a pretty moderate pace that day, but the turn back to 7 furlongs is supposed to suit this horse. I was reading that the connections might be using this as a prep for, I believe it's called the Saudi Derby on the Saudi Cup card. So they might have intentions to go for a big pot out there. I think that's a 1-turn mile race. So, I mean, take that information as for whatever you think it means. But he's a horse that definitely seems to fit this spot pretty well, just based on the distance and the class he showed as a 2-year-old.
Yeah, the Pasco, you mentioned it's a step up. I mean, this one, the two you mentioned are graded stakes winners in West Saratoga and Bookham Dano. Both have won grade 3 stakes, run well in others. So, yeah, quite the difference. And I think they're both clearly the horses to beat. I would have trouble splitting them personally. It's just a matter of, you mentioned the prep for Crazy Mason. Crazy Mason for Bookham Dano, West Saratoga. Maybe it's the same thing. He's been off over 90 days. Comes out of that Breeders' Futurity where he didn't do a whole lot of running late in that race. So you could look at this a turn back. Maybe it's a prep, but these two have real quality, and it just may not matter, as they seem to be much better than the rest of the field. There's a couple others I wanted to look at in here. I already mentioned Crazy Mason, so I'll start with him. He's a horse ran in the local inaugural stakes at Tampa, was a fast closing second. Doesn't have the speed figures to match the other two, but looks like a horse who 7 furlongs would be perfect for. He's going to need to step forward, but I couldn't blame anybody liking him. And the horse just to his outside, Branded Rocket, ran very well first time out, getting a 95 TimeformUS speed figure. Kathleen O'Connell, I pointed out on the preview, has done well with this kind off maiden wins in their second start. So I don't think that's anything to be concerned with. And this horse has a look of a horse who could move forward. So I don't think it's a gimme that the top two are going to win. The rest of the field I view more as filler. Rathmore's a horse who finished just behind Crazy Mason, a couple lengths behind, but doesn't look like a horse who wants any part of 7 furlongs. He was backing up at 6 behind Crazy Mason last time, and the others are 30-1 on the morning line, and deservedly so.
Yeah, from a ticket structure standpoint, I prefer Bookham Dano to West Saratoga. Even if they're both using it as a prep, I just think this race is a better fit for Bookham Dano, whereas West Saratoga, while he probably can get 7 furlongs, it seemed like he really improved last year with distance and racing under his belt, whereas Bookham Dano sort of came out of the gate as a professional finished product. So I'm a little more confident that he's going to show up with his best effort here. And he drew pretty well. There's a horse that has some tactical speed. So he'd be an A. West Saratoga for me would be more of a B, but I would want to use another A in this race, and that is one of the horses Craig mentioned, the number 4, Crazy Mason. And I agree with everything you said, Craig. It just feels like this horse could fit the race pretty well. He's got the recency edge on a few of the others in here. And I think when you start to take apart his last couple of races, they're a little bit better than they seem, especially that race 2 back in the Rocky Run. Watching that race, it never looked like he was so comfortable being so far back over that muddy track. He was reacting to kickback early, climbing a bit through the first half of that race. But even though it never looked like he was traveling well, he kept trying really hard and just grinding on to get up into third that day behind a horse in Copper Tax who showed real quality as a 2-year-old last year. And then last time out, the winner of that inaugural, Patriot Spirit, he's a pretty good horse. And Crazy Mason was taking a nice late shot at him at the end of that race, despite going really wide off the far turn, was powering through the stretch. I think the 7 furlongs fits this horse really well. And apparently I like Greg Sacco a lot in these Tampa Bay Stakes races on Saturday, but it just feels like he's going to be the right price compared to the 2 favorites in this race. And there is supposed to be at least a somewhat competitive pace between Bandit Rocket and Rathmore in here. So I'm just hoping the Crazy Mason can get the right trip. And from a value standpoint, I wanted to upgrade him to an A status in here.
Yeah, and one point I wanted to make about him is he was making up real ground at the end. And when you look at the pace figure line, none of them are coded in blue, but it's not like it was an ideal scenario. It was a slow first quarter, and then the race really improved at the half and just kind of gradually got a little bit faster all the way to the finish. And he was still closing. That's what makes me think the 7 furlongs will just be perfect.
Well, Craig, let's now take a deep breath and try to handle this final leg of the sequence, which is the 8th race at Oaklawn. Post time for this one is 4:52 Eastern time, 3:52 Central time. But tough Tough race here. Tough way to end the sequence. As is typical with Oaklawn, the $140,000 pot for this N1X allowance race has attracted a large field. They're going the 1 mile distance with the short run to the finish line for whatever that's worth. Maybe you want to prioritize some horses that drew inside post positions with so much of this race being run around turns. But it's a tough one to really get a handle on. I mean, I guess you might want to start the conversation with the number 6 Sicilian Grandma, who is the favorite on the morning line. She's coming out of a second place finish at this level. I can't say that I thought a ton of the race that she's coming out of. It just seemed like a bit of a weak race for the level. The fact that, I mean, she was single digit odds in there coming out of some very cheap races, I mean, is a little bit indicative of that. And she ran well. I mean, she stalked the pace and just got run down the late stages going a mile on the 16th. So the slight turn back to a mile is supposed to suit her. But I think the real reason that you'd view her as so dangerous in this race, Craig, is because the Cipriano Contreras barn has just been on fire through the early stages of this Oaklawn Park meet and has had a lot of success with Emmanuel Esquivel. So, I mean, they're hot connections, but I think that's going to be built into the price with a horse that I'm not really sure deserves to be a clear-cut favorite on form.
I would agree. And part of the reason that I think that is the pace of this race. When you look at the pace projector, it shows the red flag, which I do agree with. It also shows the horses pretty spread out, which is really unusual. But when I look at the PPs, there is some real speed in this race. It wouldn't surprise me if any of the top 4 we have, the 5 Harmonica, who 2 races back was leading a turf sprint at Belterra, is basically a sprinter, always near the front. Sicilian Grandma, who you mentioned, her best successes have all come either on the lead or right up near the lead. The 8-horse Stellar Lily went wire to wire in a 6 furlong race at my home track, Remington, last time, a race with red fractions. And then on the far outside, you just have a horse who's just dead need the lead, and Pachanga Loca, who just fires out of there every time, often in sprint races, and just rolls red fractions littered throughout her PPs. I mean, that's why she's shown on the front, but I don't think it's going to be easy from the 11 post. So I'm taking the stand that all of those horses are kind of out for me because, I mean, maybe scratches could change things, but as the field stands now, I just can't see anything but a meltdown.
Craig, the way that I look at it with a pace situation like this is the horses I really don't want any part of are the 5, 6, and 8. And that includes Sicilian Grandma, because, I mean, they're not getting the lead in here. They're probably going to be outrun or trying to chase through some very fast fractions, because I don't see any way that Pachanga Loca, unless she stumbles badly out of the gate, is not getting to the front in here. I mean, from the 11 post, Ricardo Santana has to be hustling her out of the gate. She's only successful when she gets the lead. So they're going to the front with her. Now, she's opened up on fields before and kept going. I mean, when you watch that 7 furlong race last time at Churchill, she went fast and she was dead tired at the end, just kind of walking to the line. But because she made everybody else go faster than they wanted to early, nobody could catch her. So I think there is that possibility here, especially with the short stretch run, that maybe she gaps this field out and is able to hang on. But the 11 is the only speed horse among those that I would want, because I think it's rare that you are able to be on the hard chase against a horse like that and not have the race fall apart. And if you're not leading, I think you're going to be in a tough situation.
Yeah, you said it much more succinctly than I did. I don't want the horses in behind. I don't love the 11 Pachanga Loca, but of those 4, by far, I would prefer her the most, because I do think she'll get the lead, and I just think that spells bad news for the others. But the horses I prefer, I just look through the field, and I wanted horses who are going to save some ground. It's not like you can be wide on these turns with the short stretch and the alternate finish line, and it gets really tough to win that way. So I just kind of focused on horses like the 2, 3, and 4, who I think are going to get really good trips. The one I probably prefer the most is the 4 Triple L's Cutter. Trainer Robertino Diodoro has only had her 2 starts. First time off the claim, he tried her in a $300,000 stakes race at Zia Park, and she didn't run terribly behind a horse, Flying Connection, who is good. I mean, she's a new horse who races in New Mexico, but she is actually a really good horse. So even though she lost that race by 13 lengths, she improved her speed figure off the claim. And I'm looking for her to take a step forward. And it just seems like she has some tactical speed, and almost impossible for her not to get a good trip in a race like this. The others two are inside. The Malibu Smart, the 2-horse for Chris Hartman. Same thing, has tactical speed, going to get an inside trip. Seems like she's in pretty good form coming out of a decent race at Churchill, and should get a shot here. And then the 3 is a bit more of a question mark. I don't like near as much as the other 2 I mentioned. Has never run on the dirt before, but I don't want to totally dismiss her chances because she's another with tactical speed and in inside post position.
Yeah, I didn't know what to do with Triple L's Cutter because I honestly wouldn't like her that much without the last race showing. I mean, she had faced much weaker competition at Remington and, did seem like she was coming into pretty good form, but doing so against softer foes. And it's not like she was ever competitive in that Zia Park Oaks last time, even though she finished 4th. That said, it was an improvement and it was first off the claim for Diodoro. And it's not like Diodoro has been tearing it up so far at Oaklawn Park, but still probably is, a good thing getting into his barn. So we'll see what she does here. It's a good post. I think she's pretty logical, but I didn't like her enough to really lean on her in this spot. And I think the other 2 horses you mentioned drawn towards the inside are also interesting. I wish I saw a little bit more in Malibu Smart's last race. That probably was a slightly tougher foe that she was facing in Dear Lady, who won that race and came back to win again. I don't know if I loved the rest of the field that she was in against, and that's the only race that really makes her remotely competitive in here. Like with Triple L's Cutter, it was first off the claim for a really sharp trainer, this one being for Chris Hartman, and she drew well. So I get it with her. I wasn't totally on board, but she's one that I would use. To me, the most interesting of those horses drawn inside might actually be that number 3 Delphia, because she's kept good company. She's run some nice speed figures. Again, she's got a big number against inferior competition, but her big number against inferior competition 2 back is higher than that of the 2 or the 4. It was just on synthetic. Can she handle the dirt? How do we find clues about that? Well, I think it's a good sign that she's proven she's not a turf horse. So I don't think that she's some turf synthetic lover. And when you look at her pedigree, there is dirt in there. I mean, there's not really production on the dam side, but the second dam is a horse named Light Green, who was grade 1 placed on dirt in the Prioress, ran a 109 buyer on the dirt. The Mucho Macho Mans can be pretty versatile. And Norm McKnight, whose barn has been kind of, dead compared to his controversial hot streak from long ago for the past few seasons. He's come out of the gate firing recently at Oaklawn. I mean, he sent out a limited number of horses, but they've run well at middling prices. And I think it's a barn you want to keep an eye on. And Delphia, I know she didn't run well last time off the claim for his barn, but she was chasing a fast pace that day. It's not as bad of a race as it looks. So I think she's pretty interesting, especially having drawn inside in here. Craig, I'll mention a few other horses because I was just kind of responding to what you said. I think what's important to take note of in this race is whether or not the number 13 Paris Style draws in, because if she gets in, she's pretty obviously a contender in this race. I mean, she's got form in New York and a series of speed figures that just fits really well against this field. I'll say I didn't like her last race at all. Probably didn't get the right pace set up that day. The race held together up front, but still, I thought she was a little disappointing in there. And turning back to the mile, drawing the far outside post if she gets in, that's not ideal. And Julien Leparoux, he's done okay to the start of this Oaklawn meet. I'm not sure that I view him as the kind of rider that's going to take a ton of risks to try to, find his way over to the rail from this post position. So I'm a little concerned about what kind of trip she might get. So even if she gets in, she's one that I wouldn't be upgrading that much in this race. I could potentially use her as a backup. And I wanted to keep my eye more on some horses that are in the main body of the field. And if I'm going to take a closer in this race that's drawn outside, how about the 12 Unstable Princess? I know that it looks like her form has kind of fallen apart for this barn since a trainer switch in the middle of last year, but I mean, maybe she just really liked Oaklawn last year. She was in great form through the early part of 2023, running against some nice horses, closing in those races. Yes, she's a horse that has absolutely zero early speed, and she really needs the pace to come back to her. But that might be the case in this race. In her last race, it's not like she ran that much worse than Malibu Smart in the same spot. And potentially that's a sign that she's heading back in the right direction. So at a big price, she's one that I would definitely want to include.
I have her in my maybes, which means she would probably be a C. And it's interesting you mentioned the post. We talked about it. I totally agree with you about Paris Style. I want no parts of that horse. I actually hope she does draw in because I think it'll help the price on some others. And I just don't like her with that post position and running style. But a horse like Unstable Princess, I don't think the post matters at all because she's just going to drop to the back and make a late run. Don't get me wrong, it will be tough. It's never easy for horses like that to work out a trip, particularly with the short stretch, but she's got some ability. And in a race where I think it's going to be a meltdown, I'm always going to try to find a way to put a horse who has the best TimeformUS late pace rating on the ticket. And she not only has it, she has it by a mile. I mean, hers is 101. The next horse in the main body of the field is an 83, Delphi, the 3-horse. Paris Style's a 90 if she draws in, but that's still a pretty big gap. So, yeah, I'm going to find a way to use the 12.
Now, Craig, another horse I wanted to get your opinion on is the number 7, Twirling Savi. Maybe she's just not a dirt horse, and that's a distinct possibility because her dirt races are generally a step down from her turf speed figures. But a couple of those were her first 2 starts, her career debut and her second start. It's not like she so immediately improved on turf when they put her on that surface from where she started her career. It's not like her speed figure back in July of 2022 at Canterbury was that much lower than her surrounding turf speed figures. And yeah, she didn't run well last time, but it was going 5.5 furlongs where she was just outrun from the outset of that race. She's never gone long on the dirt. There is pedigree for her to stretch out. It's a bit of a question mark, but she's going to be a big price in this race, not just because of that question about the surface, but she's also got a 10-pound bug rider on her back. So, I mean, who knows what the trip is going to be, but at least she's shown real quality. And there are a lot of horses in this race that I'm just not sure that they really belong at this level. And I think that this one does. It's just a matter of whether or not she can work out the right trip over this surface.
I tried to make a case for her. It's a sequence that, it's so tough. I really want to be careful who I put on here. And I just couldn't quite make the leap. I looked at all her dirt races. The one thing I didn't like is she just has zero speed, but she also isn't really doing any running in the stretch in any of her dirt races either. So that's why, and the 10-pound bug boy is a big negative for me. Hasn't really shown me much either, but mostly I just have real questions this horse that a mile is going to help her. Turf is different. She's run fine on turf. Her long races, she's made some indent in the finish, but her dirt races I watched the last couple of them and she was just dead with a furlong to go, did really nothing. So she wasn't for me.
Is there anybody else in this race, Craig, that you wanted to mention? We covered a lot of ground, but I mean, this is the kind of race where you can build a case for a lot of horses.
No, I think it covered all. I mean, the most of the ones we mentioned are huge long shots, and not that those don't win at Oaklawn because we've seen some. I think I saw a pick 5 that paid over 6 figures not too long ago. So strange stuff does happen at Oaklawn. I assume it's going to be very cold at Oaklawn on Saturday because it's pretty darn cold here in Oklahoma City today, and they usually follow us by about a day. So I'll have to check the weather. It doesn't look like any precipitation, but it'll be worth watching the early races and seeing how the track is playing, because I know they had some issues with the track last week, and it's just something to keep an eye on. I'll even be watching today as they race as we record this on Friday, just to try to get a feel, because in the dead of winter at Oaklawn, it's not the same track we're going to be seeing when they run the Arkansas Derby later in the meet. It's definitely a quirky track that yields some very strange results.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I did look up the weather forecast. I think the rain is supposed to not come to Oaklawn until Sunday. So we should be good for Saturday as long as the issues from last week are worked out. But like you said, you don't want to get in that situation where temperatures are causing the track to become in question, because obviously if this race gets canceled or if the day gets canceled, then this entire cross-country pick 5 sequence gets canceled. So hopefully that's not the case and they're able to sort out all the issues from last week. Craig, I do want to mention just one more horse in this race, which I know is kind of getting to the point of being ridiculous because we're talking about almost everybody. But the number 9 Lady Commander is one that at least deserves a mention, because if you just say, hey, she's not a turf horse, and if you draw a line through her last couple of races, she makes a lot of sense in here. And I know there's some layoffs to deal with and, connections that don't take as much money as some others in this race. But I mean, she was running at this level at Oaklawn last winter, getting a piece of some races against better horses than this. I mean, especially when she faced Coastal Charm, Adeline Julia. So, I mean, if you go back to last year and say that getting back to Oaklawn on the dirt is going to be what she wants, there's a case to be made for her, and I'm pretty confident she's going to be double-digit odds in this race.
Yeah, she was one I definitely considered as well, and maybe she'll be on my tickets for the reasons you said. If you just ignore her last 2 races, she fits perfectly in here. I mean, even her race at Church or at Oaklawn last spring, where she ran a 97 TimeformUS speed figure while finishing 5th, that fits just fine in this race. I mean, it's only a race rating of 99, and when you look through the field, those 99s are few and far between. Most of these horses are mid-90s types on their best day. So, yeah, I have no issue with her. I mean, I was a little leery of the rider. No knock on John Cord, but he's not riding like he did years ago for sure. He's certainly not winning at that kind of percentage. But, you're going to get paid for it if you do bet a horse like this.
Yeah, and you could make the argument that John Cord is still a better rider to have on your back with those years of experience than a 10-pound bug rider if we're deciding between those two horses. So definitely a lot of ways to go in that finale. And for me, it's a race where I'm going to be looking to spread, but spread without that horse that I think could be favored, Sicilian Grandma. I'm not using her on my tickets, and I think you probably feel the same, Craig.
Yeah, definitely not. I'm not using any of those horses in behind the 11 on the pace projector that look like they want to be on or near the lead. I've just seen this too many times in my life. When there is a horse like Pachanga Loca in the field, it almost always spells doom for the others that have similar running styles.
Well, let's do a brief recap of this sequence. I'll go first this week to just kind of summarize how I might play this, and it's not an easy ticket to put together. I think it quickly could get very expensive, especially in that last race. So I'm going to try to just narrow it down to my strongest opinions. In that 7th race at Tampa, the Gasparilla, I'm going to lean on the 2, Copper Bound, and the 6, Gorgeous Girl, the pair from the Greg Sacco barn. And if I'm out in the first leg and Mystic Lake beats me, so be it. But I did not want to play this sequence, including her on my tickets. The 8th race at Aqueduct, leg 2, I am going to primarily use the 3 expected value, the 4 Cascais, and the 8 Principe d'Oro, maybe pressing the 8 a little bit, depending on how I need to structure this to make it affordable. But those were the 3 I was most interested in. I was on the fence about the 11 Whittington Park, but at the end of the day, I was going to take a bit of a wait-and-see approach with that one, given the layoff. In the 9th race at Aqueduct, the middle leg of this cross-country pick 5 sequence, for me, it's just really about 2 horses. Obviously, the Big Torpedo, who is way the horse to beat in this spot. And I also want to use the number 6, Malibu Margarita, pretty much an equal strength. Just a horse that I think we haven't yet seen the best out of and does have real upside in this race, turning back from a distance where he probably needed the start. Moving on to race 9 at Tampa Bay Downs, the Pasco Stakes, race leg 4 of this sequence. I like the number 4, Crazy Mason. I think he's going to be the right price. If I can afford it, I'm leaning towards using him as an A along with the number 3, Bookham Dano, and then West Saratoga being more of a backup type. But like I was alluding to, going 2 by 2 by 2 or by 2 by 2 by 3 by 2. I mean, the sequence starts to get expensive very quickly when you're not singling in any of these legs. And then moving on to the final leg of the sequence, Oaklawn race 8. I mean, really, it's just how many horses can I afford to use of those that I like, because it's a difficult one. And if I've got to narrow it down, I can sort of get it down to 5 horses that I'm keeping in the mix, and then I have to sort them out from there. And those 5 horses would be the 2 Malibu Smart, the 3 Delphia, the 4 Triple L's Cutter, the 9 Lady Commander, and the 12 Unstable Princess. Among those, just from a value standpoint, I'm probably leaning towards the 3 and the 12 most of all, with a 9 kind of being on the fence. But it's a tough one. I think you've got to make some value-based decisions, especially in this last leg, to make this affordable.
Yeah, this ticket could get very expensive, and I wish I had went in the ticket maker. It's something I'll do before the race, but I don't like to waste a lot of time on that before we have the scratches, because that can often change things quite a bit. So I'll just kind of list the horses I like in each race and separate the horses I like the most from the ones I maybe don't like quite as much. In that first leg, the Gasparilla Stakes at Tampa, I kind of narrowed it down. I think Gorgeous Girl is clearly the horse to beat, so that horse would be an A for me. And the other A would be Runaway Diva. I'm going to stick with a little bit as a first-time starter who I think offers some upside. And then other horses I would use on a lower tier would be the horse you like, Copper Bound, and 3-horse Delightful Summer, and maybe Gervin's Princess. So I'm a little skeptical of that the more I looked at it, of just how cheap the races are she comes out of. At Aqueduct for the second leg, and I believe that's race number 8, the allowance race. I'm gonna use both of the Chad Brown horses as A's, Expected Value and Cascase. And then I will also use a little bit of Whittingham Park and Silo Ridge, but they would be on like B and C tiers. In the 9th race, I'm going to have almost all of my play going through the Big Torpedo, but I mean, he's going to be the favorite. You kind of talked me into the 6-horse Malibu Margarita a little bit. I could use him as a B. It's just going to be a case of where I look at the odds. I don't want to play tickets where I have 3 or 4 favorites on them. So I'll try to narrow it down to, when I make my tickets, I try to keep it where I'll have 2, no more than 3 favorites, and among those, there won't be odds on horses. Not always easy to do, which is why I do rely on Ticketmaker. Going back to Tampa for that 9th race, the Pasco Stakes. I don't have anything against the 2 favorites at all. The more I look at it, I picked West Saratoga on top when we did our preview. I would probably lean more on Bookham Dano. I just think he's more likely to run good in this race, but I would also use Banded Rocket, who I found that good stat for Kathleen O'Connell. She does fine. I think that horse has some room to improve, but I'm not going to dismiss Crazy Mason and West Saratoga either. So I'd have like 2 A's and 2 B's in this one. And then for that last race at Oaklawn, there'll probably be some spreading in here for sure. I don't want any parts of the speed horses, as we talked about, except with the possibility of Pachanga Loca. I'm really torn on if I want to use that one or not. Chances are I won't, because I want to keep the ticket reasonable. My main leans in this race will be the 2, 3, and 4, Malibu Smart, Delphia, and Triple L's Cutter. But I will definitely use the 9 and 12 as horses who are going to be bigger prices, and I expect to get a really nice pace set up.
Yeah, not an easy sequence to put together by any means. Like Craig was alluding to, you really want to keep a close eye on scratches and reassess things, maybe places you can cut or slim down once scratches do come out on Saturday. So just something to take note of. But I still thought this was a really interesting sequence to talk about. Even going through it, there might be some races you want to play individually. Doubles and pick threes are always an option, especially at Aqueduct and Tampa, where you've got those interesting sequences of races. So many options for the players, even if you feel like this cross-country pick 5 sequence is getting a little bit too complicated for you. But still enjoyed discussing this one, doing some handicapping with Craig, getting back into the routine of doing these every week. Always enjoyed doing this handicapping on the podcast. And everybody, want to thank you for listening this week. Remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch Craig and I. We're back next Tuesday recapping some of these races from this upcoming weekend.